to this meeting of the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria. For those who are not from Victoria, welcome to our sunny spot here, and welcome to everybody else. Our meeting today has a very interesting topic, and it's part one of two meetings that we're going to have on how reading the Bible can mess up your life or provide guidance for living. We're very glad you can join us for this, and I'm sure that it will arouse many thoughts in your mind about Bible passages too. Here we go. There are going to be three speakers today. It's David Merritt and Robert Renton and Rod Peppiett, and I'll introduce those as they come to speak. They will each give two Bible passages, which are definitely not helpful and could potentially mess up your life. And you can expect a fair dose of negativity and that sort of in this section. But stay with us, because then all three each will go on to present two passages which are good examples of guidance for living today. Now, it needs to be said at this point that will bring up many questions, thoughts, comments, how these passages have affected people's lives, what's going on in the world, what needs to be said, all that kind of thing. And so that you can fully discuss those afterwards, we'll have breakout groups. I'll talk about those when we come to them. There's a great deal of joy to be had in breakout groups, so I look forward to taking part in one of them. Now, and remember also, if you want to go back and revisit any of these topics and speakers, there will be a video recording of this later this week on the PCNV website. Now, to the speakers straight away. The first is David Merritt, and I asked David to provide me with a little bio so that just in case you haven't known what he does. The first person, he says, the first person to give two examples of reading the Bible that could mess up your life, here is David. He was a foundation member of this organisation, PCNV. That's back in 2006, and has featured often in our programs and is a guiding light in thoughts about what we might do. He has university degrees in arts, education and theology, and long experience in the Uniting Church as National Director of Christian Education. David, how can the Bible mess up our life?
Thank you, Lorna, and a welcome to all who are joining us for this Zoom program. It was about 50 years ago, as a minister, that I made a decision that I would never read in church or in public anything from the Old Testament book of Joshua. And I'm going to break that today for the first time. Joshua is the sixth book in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and allegedly tells us the story of Israel from the start of the conquest of Canaan up to the time they were conquered by the Babylonian Empire centuries later. Few scholars think that this is a record made at the time. It's a much later story told by victors, and it starts with a speech by God commanding the conquest. I think it is a blood-curdling story of barbarity instructed by God. At one point in this story, Joshua receives a request by the king of a small country to help that king fight another small country attacking them. And the text says that the Lord told Joshua, "Don't be afraid of them. They will run away when you attack, and I will help you defeat them." And Joshua took some of his best warriors and marched all night and made a surprise attack. And now I quote from this book of Joshua, chapter 10. "The Lord made the attacked camp panic, and the Israelites started killing them right and left. And while they were going through Beth Horon Pass, the Lord made huge hailstones fall on them. More of the enemy soldiers died from the hail than from the Israelite weapons. So around midday, Joshua prayed to the Lord loud enough for the Israelites to hear, "Our Lord, make the sun stop in the sky over Gibeon, and the moon stand still over Ajalon Valley." So the sun and moon stopped and stood still until Israel defended its enemies. End of the quote. If I take that part of the Bible as in some way about what a supernatural God directed, and that similar actions today could be encouraged by that belief, then my life will truly be messed up, and I'll be a menace to some other people. Now, you might think it's a small incident a long time ago, but it influenced people for centuries. For example, when the great sweeping changes to knowledge in our Western world began at the beginning of the 17th century, a lot more than 2,000 years after that incident we read from Joshua, this part of the Bible was taken as truth from God. At the end of the 16th century, the view of the universe approved by the church was that the earth was central and the sun and moon went round the earth, and that's based on the ancient creation stories at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Early in the 17th century, a man called Galileo wrote a book based on his actual observations using a telescope he actually made himself, and that enabled him to see a large number of occasions of planets and moons around them. And in the latter part of the previous century, towards the end of the 16th century, a Polish monk, Copernicus, had recorded some years before and had concluded that the sun was central and not the earth. Anyway, Galileo described the sun as central, with the earth going round the sun. Galileo was forbidden by the Pope to publish or speak about his discoveries because they did not fit the creation stories or the writing of the Bible about the sun standing still. And Galileo ended his life confined to his house. Now today, for us, Galileo and Copernicus are justly celebrated as pioneers of modern knowledge. And today, I think some parts of the Bible have messed up religion. Reading them with respect can mess up our lives, and I do not honour them as part of our religion. The second passage I've picked to support the main point I'm making is the first letter of Timothy in the New Testament, a letter allegedly by Paul to Timothy. Scholars don't think that it's likely to have been written by Paul, but it carries Paul's name and it's read by many as authoritative because it's in the Bible. It's not only likely to mess up your life, its influence is observably current in Australia today. And it's one of the disastrous passages in the ancient writings we call the Bible. I'll read the first letter of Timothy, chapter 2, from verse 9. And please note not only the statement about how women should behave, but some very fancy footwork to show that sin in the world wasn't really due to the man Adam, but it was really due to the woman. So, reading from 1 Timothy. I would like women to wear modest and sensible clothes. They should not have fancy hairdos or wear expensive clothes or put on jewelry made of pearl or gold. Women who claim to love God should do helpful things for others, and they should learn by being quiet and paying attention. They should be silent and not be allowed to teach or to tell men what to do. After all, Adam was created before Eve, and the man Adam wasn't the one who was fooled. It was the woman Eve who was completely fooled and sinned. But women will be saved by having children if they stay faithful, loving, holy, and modest. End of quote. Now, I don't think I really need to say much about that passage to make you think it is truly bizarre in our world. In Australia and much of the world at the present time, we're still dealing with bias against women and violence by men against women, and parts of the Bible have contributed to this. It's a reason why I think that reading the Bible can truly mess up your life. Over to you, Lorna.
There we are. Thanks, David. And a little more negativity from this time, Robert Renton, on a couple of passages that Robert will have chosen to see how the Bible can mess up your life. Now, I have a little word to say about Robert in case you haven't met him before either. Robert has been, he's now a retired Uniting Church minister, has been in schools as a teacher and in ministry, and in schools as teacher, chaplain, headmaster, and notably we might mention Penley and Essendon Grammar and Wesley College, and obviously in the education business. Robert, would you like to educate us now about a couple of passages that you think can mess up your life?
Thank you, Lorna. I guess the point of reading the Bible is that without the context of faith or heritage or instruction, it can really not have a great deal of effect on your life. But if you read the Bible in the context of church or Sunday school, as a member of a religious family, or as a consequence of deliberate instruction, then it brings out other questions that are hard to deal with. See, I went to Sunday school from a very early age because my mum was my teacher. They were interesting visual aids that made the stories I heard come alive. There were flannel graphs and there were sand trays, and they were popular. So what did I learn from the early Bible stories? One that was popular and recounted in dramatic effect and was turned into a brilliant movie by Cecil B. DeMille called The Ten Commandments is the story of the Passover. Too long to read now, of course, but let me just read one portion from Exodus. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh awoke in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night, and he said, "Rise, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go serve the Lord as you said. Take your flocks, take your herds as you said, and be gone." So what did I learn from that messed up my life, if you like? Well, I learned that there was a powerful God who was concerned only for some people and not others, that this God punished people who got in the way of God's will, that it was acceptable for one people to steal the land of another people, that war was an acceptable way of getting one's way and access to greater amenities, a land, for example, that was flowing with milk and honey. The ramifications of this learning from the Bible were immense, and they are immense in this world right now in the Middle East. The second learning from the Bible that, in a sense, affected my life in the earlier days was much more subtle And although there were a few outstanding examples that broke the mould, I learned that women were not as important as men and that they had a subservient role in life. Did you know that, for example, there are over 3,000 proper names in the Bible? 142 of them are women. Of those 142, 95 are mentioned by name only as daughters, wives, or mothers of famous men, many of whom were seen as the property of men and were part of a polygamous society. 6 were named as a substitute for infertile wives, for example, Hagar, or as a comfort to an old man, Abishag. So there's only 47 women left in the Bible who can be grouped as either good women or bad women. The good slightly outweigh the bad. The good ones were mostly mentioned only once, and we get nothing more about them, and only 5 stand out a little more, but not much more. Ruth, Dorcas, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, and Mary, Jesus' mother. Most of the 16 bad women of the Bible are better known, and their badness is almost always defined in terms of their sexuality. 2 are mentioned as Eve, of course, and as Mary Magdalene. The tradition has labelled Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, and yet there is no evidence to support that tradition. Let me read this admonition. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as just as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself is to save its Saviour. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. That was in Ephesians chapter 5. So once again, the Bible subtly gives this little boy who grows into a man the firm conviction that man's place in the world is different and greater than women's place. Centuries of practice continue to mess up our minds, not only of men, of course, but also of women. And it comes as an immense surprise when women's liberation and all the various facets of the challenge to this messed up way of thinking hit the headlines. And domestic violence, as David just said, is only one aspect of the messed up way of thinking. Thanks, Lorna.
Thanks a lot, Robert, for that overview, which is really quite challenging. And given the time over which that has been effective, it's quite frightening. We have a third speaker who will give to us a couple of passages or his views on things that can mess you up when you read the Bible, and his name is Rod Peppiatt. Rod also, I've asked for a bio some time ago. Here we are, Rod. This is what you told me about yourself. You are a husband, dad, and granddad. That's still true, I'm sure. A minister of the Uniting Church. That's true. Currently based at Blackburn. And I read this passage with interest, and you will too. Rod has a restless passion for church and the way of life shown in Jesus of Nazareth. Let's hear what you think can mess up your life, Rod.
I'm sorry, my mouse wasn't letting me unmute. Thank you, Lorna, and thanks everyone. My first particular passage, I have a little bit of trepidation in suggesting it's not helpful in any sense. That's quite a personal reflection. I'll come to that in a minute. But I used to be an optical mechanic in a previous life, and I used to help people. I used to grind lenses for specs and used to help fit them to others, and I've worn glasses for over 50 years myself. And lenses matter to me, and they are something of which I'm very aware. And it struck me that that's actually a really good image for me as I think about how we read the Bible and other books and other sources, in a sense, what we look through. To recognise my own lenses, I'm a 21st century, white, middle-aged man in a wealthy country, a bit left-wing, raised in a church to believe that certain things, certain statements were true. My first example, or my first category in a way, is ignoring or being unaware of the lenses through which we read the Bible, which can be helpful or not. And the first reading is this, John 3:16 and 17. No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved in him. Now, I'm trying not to look at the chat numbers to see if anyone left while I was reading that. The lens through which I have read that passage for probably the first 35 years of my life was that God sent his Son into the world to die for my sins, and that if I believed that, I would be saved. It first became problematic for me when I became a parent, and the idea of sending my son to die. It was then problematic, the idea, because it seemed to me to be reducing the life of Jesus to effectively a glorified suicide mission. Your role in this world, my boy, is to die. I gave up that understanding of God many years ago, and for a long time I ignored this passage. But I discovered a few years ago now that my lens through which I looked at it was a bit scratched and blurry, and it was worth going back for another crack. Because nowhere in that passage are the words death or die. Nor are they in the passage from which Moses talks about lifting up the serpent in the wilderness from Numbers 21. There, people who had been bitten by a snake could look at the raised serpent and live. It was a bronze snake, it didn't have to die. My question, which I know has a very personal thing in it, but I wonder how many others have believed the same thing. Can we not say that in Jesus' time on this earth, we saw glimpses of what it looks like when we truly live? If we only read passages like this through the lens of atoning death on our behalf because we are completely unacceptable to God otherwise, do not the stories of Jesus become irrelevant, or is just his life just a means to an end? This is a teaching of Jesus about life, I'm convinced. It's not a teaching about him dying so that I could be acceptable to God when I die. It took me 40 plus years probably, but I'm glad that I cleaned my specs and went back for another go, because otherwise I would have missed something of the richness that I think is potentially there in this passage. It doesn't have to mess up our lives, but I'm pretty sure it's messed up quite a few. Lenses matter. And the second reading is also deals, I guess, picks up lenses as well. And it's Based on the idea that God is an all-powerful being who blesses and curses individuals, or worse, and all we can really do is kind of suck that up and say, well, God's bigger than me, so God can do what, and yes, it is, he can do what he likes. From Job chapter 1, verse 6. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, aka Satan, also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" The accuser answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then the accuser answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to the accuser, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord. That's Job chapter 1, verses 6 to 12. There's a couple of conversations in the beginning of Job that run the same way. To put it crudely, it seems to me, Job is reduced in this story to the object of a bet between God and Satan. He loses his wife and children and everything precious to him. Everything and everyone, I should say. Almost worse, Job grieves his misfortune to his three friends, and he justifiably asserts his innocence. And then, to make matters even worse, his friends attack him. They say things like, "Are you sure you're innocent? What's God trying to teach you?" Or, "God is good, so this disaster must be your own fault. Search your own soul." We have a name for this victim blaming, and it still goes on, including in defense of God. Job is a very long book, and I certainly don't propose to read it all. And if we skipped towards the end, we have Job having a conversation with God where he tries to work out what the heck has happened to him. And it's basically a futile encounter with the inscrutability of God. And at the end of it, God's honor is satisfied and Job is humbled. In his humility, the story tells us Job is vindicated by God. His friends are sent packing. He receives back double what he had before, including 7 more sons and 3 more daughters who turn out to be the most beautiful in all of the land. I quote, "He lives happily ever after, but I wonder what his first wife thought of it. Oh wait, she's still dead." I find this a story that if I sat with it for very long, it would mess up my life just as surely as the ones that David and Robert have mentioned. When we try to build attitudes towards others on such stories, I think we do enormous damage. Thanks, Lorna. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you very much. Well, that was the negativity. That was the negative side. And now, with hope and anticipation, we turn back to our 3 speakers to hear passages that will give us guidance and hope and benefit for our living. And so I'm going to go back to David first. David, it's your turn. Hope and positivity.
Sorry, the delay was that I'd just been told that the speaker had been muted and I needed to turn it off. Interestingly, I found this, let me get rid of that. I found the second part of this exercise actually more daunting than the first part, not because I couldn't identify guidance for living, but immediately identify guidance for living, there's an implied question, well, why don't you take the guidance, or how much of it are you doing? So with that caution at the start, I did find it relatively easy to identify how the Bible can provide some guidance for my living. My first example is from Luke chapter 19. It's a well-known incident about Jesus' reputation for being welcoming to people who are sick, desperately poor, or looked down on by others because they were rich by collecting taxes for the occupying Roman army. And I'll read a part of the story in Luke 19, and I think Robert will read more of this. Quote, Jesus was going through Jericho, where a man named Zacchaeus lived. He was in charge of collecting taxes and was very rich. Zacchaeus wanted to see what Jesus was like, but Zacchaeus was a short man and couldn't see over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree. When Jesus got there, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, hurry down. I want to stay with you today. Zacchaeus hurried down and gladly welcomed Jesus. Everyone who saw this started grumbling. This man, Zacchaeus, is a sinner, and Jesus is going home to eat with him. End of quote. You and I live in one of the world's richest countries. Because of the DNA I received from my parents and the education they arranged for me, I'm comfortably off in a society where inequality is a confronting fact of life, and a world where we're informed from day to day that there are millions without enough food, medicine, or even shelter. There's lots of evidence in the Gospels in the New Testament that Jesus earned a reputation for giving attention to people who were looked down on by well-to-do people. And I can't begin to deserve such a reputation, but Jesus' example is actually a significant influence on how I live, how I spend money, and how I vote. As we're a society where money is an indicator of how I live, I take Jesus' example as at least a little influence when planning how I live. And as you will all know, this month is checkup month for tax and how we've done in the previous year. My annual tax return tells me how much I've given to people with desperate needs and how much on ensuring I and my family live well. I learned from Peter Singer, that's a wonderful professor of ethics at Princeton University, that setting a percentage of income to go towards meeting needs of others can start quite low, for example, 2% when we have family obligations or low income, and expand to say 10% when our financial situation is better. And I find that that practical implementation of Jesus' overwhelming emphasis on help for the disadvantaged is wisdom for living that actually does make a difference in how I think and in how I live. My second example, you may think is too well known to need looking at. It's the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. It's certainly well known, but many using the Bible impose their own assumed meanings onto the reading and miss what Jesus was talking about. And I find it is often there, this story, when I think about how to live. Even when I know I fall short, this story is still a voice for me with guidance. So why does Luke, whoever he was, the writer of that gospel, why does Luke say Jesus told this story? How did Luke launch the story? The story is for a religious leader. It has four main characters. I've sometimes heard the story told where there appears to be only two, an injured man and a Samaritan. And it's not immediately obvious to us who the Samaritan is. In the Gospel of John, Jesus asks a Samaritan woman getting water from a village well to give him a drink of water. And she's startled and says, "Why do you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for that? Because the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. We worship in different places." So against that background, I read now, word for word from the Bible, from Luke 10. An expert in the law of Moses stood up and asked Jesus a question to see what he would say. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to have eternal life?" Jesus answered, "What is written in the scriptures? How do you understand them?" And then there's a brief conversation in which the religious leader and Jesus agree that a good answer is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbour as much as you love yourself. I go back now to quote. But the man wanted to show that he knew what he was talking about. So he asked Jesus, "Who are my neighbours?" Jesus replied, and here's the story. As a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, robbers attacked him and grabbed everything he had. They beat him up and ran off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. But when he saw the man, he walked by on the other side. Later, a temple worker came to the same place, but when he saw the man who had been beaten up, he also went by on the other side. A man from Samaria then came travelling along that road. When he saw the man, he felt sorry for him and went over to him. He treated his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put him on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next morning, he gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins and said, "Please take care of the man. If you spend more than this on him, I will pay you when I return." Then Jesus asked, "Which one of these 3 people was a real neighbour to the man who was beaten up by robbers?" The teacher answered, "The one who showed pity." And Jesus said, "Go and do the same." What that says to me is that the main issue is not religion, and religion is often not a help. The 2 outstanding religious leaders did nothing and were not participants in help. The man who helped was religious, quite differently from the first 2, but it turned into practical help. And I think that that practical help is the key to that story of Jesus. And I find it is guidance for how I try to live. Thanks, Alana.
Thank you very much, David. Robert, it's your turn now to bring us a couple of passages that you find good guidance for living. Your turn.
Here I am. Thank you, Donna. My first story is, as David has already suggested, is the same story from Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus and Jesus. So I won't read it again. Maybe you can get the impression that all tax agents or rich people are bad people. And maybe that has some relevance in our popular culture. But much more important is the message and the guidance that a person's badness does not have to be the bar to having something to do with him or her. Given that throughout the New Testament, Jesus is regarded as the Son of God, the Messiah, the hero of the story, if you like, the decision to enter the house of Zacchaeus plays a role in providing better guidance for living. Not all attempts to work with so-called bad people turn out as well as in the story of Zacchaeus. But the truth is, often the views of people observing this kind of care of the unloved are pretty similar to the way Jesus was viewed. So the guidance for living in this passage is also realizing that there is likely to be a cost in helping disreputable, unpopular, and sometimes people like prisoners. The so-called good people may well criticise or even cause you a considerable amount of grief. Let me tell you a story that affected me quite significantly. Many years ago, when I was still a boy, there was a delightful old Irish couple who regularly attended our church every Sunday. In those days, the newspaper sometimes printed information about divorces. And this time, there was a notice that the old Irishman's wife in Ireland had divorced him. It was not the woman he was living with. The old Irish couple were, in fact, living in a de facto relationship. Today, that doesn't shock, but by jingoes, it did then. And that was too much for our church, apparently, for they left immediately, and I had no idea where they went. I was both equally sad and they either felt they couldn't trust anybody in the church or that they had been shunned by others. The guidance for living contained in the story of Zacchaeus had not been heard, but it is good guidance for living. The second story is the rebuke that Jesus offers to disciples from Luke chapter 9. An argument arose among them concerning which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, aware of their inner thoughts, took a little child and put it by his side, and he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For the least among you, all of you, is the greatest." As a youngster, like everybody else, I was taught to respect my elders and betters, and I began to think that wealth equaled importance, and the position of responsibility, respectability, and authority meant greatness. That was, I suppose, a realistic understanding given the nature of the society in which we live. However, the concomitant reality was that the men, particularly the Aboriginal men, who worked as labourers in the fertiliser factory, where I sometimes worked during the holidays, were seen as lesser beings, dropkicks, and worse, at the bottom of the barrel, and it was all their own fault anyway. That feeling, that lack of appreciation of these men's essential humanity and worth, might have continued on my mind were it not for the stories of Jesus and this particular passage where greatness is turned on its head, something for which I am eternally grateful. Thank you, Lorna.
Thank you, Robert, for two very poignant stories. Thanks a lot. And now, with two, at least, probably from Rod, stories of messages, guidance that can help us in our lives. What have you to say, Rod?
Thank you, Lorna. I'm currently reading Hugh Mackay's latest book. It's called The Way We Are. And in it, there's a chapter where he focuses on the difference between the accumulation of knowledge and data and the gaining of wisdom. He puts those two as different things. Interestingly, I've heard that before, but interestingly, Mackay does it in the context of morality, which he describes as inherently relational. And he describes morality as arising from our need to live with one another in creative and life-giving ways. That's his working definition there of morality. Our need to live with one another in creative and life-giving ways. His conversation and that understanding of morality recognizes that none of us knows everything. None of us can be everything. And that wisdom comes as we work out together what matters for the community. My first reading says something similar. About 2,000 years ago, Paul, to my mind, said something quite similar to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 13. For now we see a reflection, as in a mirror, he says, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love remain. These three, and the greatest of these is love. I'm sure most of us remember senses of what comes before this in 1 Corinthians 13, because we've all been to weddings, haven't we? But at the end of a letter which is correcting the individualism and the worship practice which exclude people, personal big noting and general divisions. This is what Paul sees as the wisdom of the Christ. We don't know it all, he says, but we have enough to go on with. Faith, hope, and love remain, these three, and the greatest of these is love. As I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that a few years ago now, in another state, I led a funeral for a lady in our church who asked for 1 Corinthians 13 to be read at her funeral. But she said, I want it to be the King James Version. And I read and I thought, what's going on here? What does she want? What's she trying to tell us? And I looked there and realized that instead of faith, hope, and love, it's faith, hope, and charity. I thought, okay, is that just because she liked the old-fashioned wording? Then I realized and did a little bit of work and thinking about it. And I realized and talked to some people that for her, she wanted charity, not in the sense of, we give to charity or whatever, this is a charity. She wanted charity, caritas. She wanted it at her funeral because for her, this was the outworking of love. Charity was what made an attitude and a life of charity was what made love concrete rather than abstract. And it was for her what made love something that was enacted. It almost made love a verb, if you like. And I have been deeply grateful for that wisdom. And I talked about it with her husband and with some friends, and we concluded that, yes, that is what she meant. It's probably one of the not too many occasions where my preferred reading has been from the King James, but that's okay. We don't know it all, says Paul, but we do have enough to go on with, to know how to live lives of meaning, lives which are creative, and lives which reflect the way of the Christ. And my other reading, I could have picked up a whole lot of different ones, but I've gone with one from Matthew's Gospel. I believe Jesus, or I experienced Jesus as a storyteller beyond all else. And I've often heard that he told parables to help people understand tricky ideas and used simple examples to show what he was trying to say. But for me, I think the parables are much less about helping people to say sort of, oh, I see, and much more about inviting them to say, huh? What do you mean? This is a story of a master who hired labourers to work in his vineyard at 3 different times of the day. The last ones, because no one had hired them. He hired them, I sense, to give them some work to do. The particular part that I want to read to you picks up what happened when he paid them at the end of the day. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the labourers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. When the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" Quite some years ago now, Margaret Thatcher asserted that there's no such thing as society or community, just individuals with competing needs who sort of stick together out of convenience and can be abandoned if circumstances mean we're no use to each other. It was a culture built on the idea that we get what we pay for, or perhaps, can I say, if you have a go, you get a go. Jesus' parables tell us something else. They give us an invitation to imagine a different way. Imagine a world based around grace and generosity rather than competition and me first. What might be the ways of politics or ethics or economics, even international relations, if we imagine such a world? And then, as David said, do something about what we imagine. What if that's the way of holiness? Thank you, Lorna.